For those of you that don't know me, and why should you, my name's Becky and I'm one of the event directors here at Phacilitate, and I am your friendly moderator for today's webinar. Nothing more, nothing less. So before we get started, just a couple of house rules, if you will. So you will see on your screen in the top right-hand corner, there's sort of like two little squares. This is our kind of generic chat, if you will. So if you want to introduce yourselves to each other, then you are, of course, more than welcome to. I can already see we've got a couple of comments in there. So Andrea, hello. You're more than welcome for the invite. I'm glad you can join us. Isabella, hi. Fantastic. We're excited to be here as well. So absolutely wonderful that you're already introducing yourselves to one another. But if you want to ask a question, please do not put it in this chat because it is more likely to get missed. So any questions that you want to ask our fantastic panel, please put them in the Q&A, and that's the little sort of speech bubble with the question mark in it. So we will get to as many as we can. We've got time at the end for Q&A. So if you want to do that, please do that there, because I guarantee that I probably will miss any questions that you put in the chat. So that's the boring admin things sort of out the way. We've got sort of nearly 50 people joining us so far, which is amazing. I know more are going to trickle in, but we're going to kick off. So first of all, I want to start by taking you back to the future. So not that long ago, launching a cell therapy meant building almost everything from scratch. When the first CAR T therapies came to the market, there was no commercialization blueprint, no established infrastructure, no off-the-shelf digital backbone. And every relationship, every process, every system had to be designed, tested, and built in real time around a single therapy. It worked because it has to. But that world no longer exists. So today, the CGT landscape looks fundamentally different. What was once primarily a single asset focus has become multi-portfolio complexity. Science is evolving faster. Clinical data is reshaping pathways in real time, and organizations are no longer building for one therapy. They're scaling across pipelines, across geographies, and often through acquisition. And with that shift comes a new kind of pressure. Many of the systems and processes still in place were designed for a very different moment. A moment where the science was more fixed, the pathways were more predictable, and where building something once felt like enough. And it simply isn't anymore. So now the challenge is not just how you deliver a therapy, but how you adapt continuously as the science, the data, and the portfolios evolve around you. And this is really where today's conversation sits, and where these amazing panelists bring a valuable perspective. It's not in telling the industry what to do, but in helping shape how we think about it. So through the lens of digital backbone, process design, and the realities of scaling in a space that simply refuses to stand still. So the question we're exploring today is this: what does the right digital infrastructure look like now? How do you build frameworks, systems, and ways of working that are not just fit for today, but adaptable enough for what comes next? And perhaps most importantly, what do we take from those early pioneering days, not to replicate them, but to evolve beyond them? And that's exactly what we're here to unpack. So we're going to kick off with a poll, and we're asking you to interact already. So hopefully you should see this up on stage now. If the technology works, here we go. So hopefully you should all be able to see that now. So the poll we're starting with is, which of the three domains concerns you most right now? So if everyone can cast their votes. We've got one vote. That's a good start. 2, here we go. I mean, I will keep this up until we have more than 2 votes. Like there are many, many more than 2 people in the room right now. So there we go. So I'm going to leave it open for a couple more minutes just to see, although at the moment it's looking as though we've got sort of digital ecosystem as being sort of the top. So there, we'll give it a couple more seconds. There we go. Everyone's voting now. That's what we like. Engagement. Fantastic. Perfect. There we go. Thank you, everyone. So um, I'll just share those results with everyone. So as you say, we've got, there's a sort of a slight clear winner there. But why this conversation? And obviously, why now? Why not tomorrow? Why hasn't it been had before? So, Anthony, do you want to kick us off, with that sort of
Sure.
discussion then?
Happy to. Well, thanks, Becky, and thanks everybody for joining. I appreciate everybody taking a little time this morning. Well, what's interesting is that we were at Phacilitate in February of this year, and we had a roundtable. And one of the things that came out from that roundtable that we learned is that the science is advancing faster than the operating model, and that kind of started to get us to think. We've seen this a bit. What is happening there, right? So the one of the issues that we see, and one of the reasons why I want to have this conversation is that the orchestration maturity is lagging a little bit. In other words, that's the gaps in the handoffs between the different folks. So you've got your digital ecosystem, which is your tools. You've got your treatment journey coordination, which is your tracking, and then you've got governance. And all three of these are important. And you really need to be able to track and measure how you're doing within those. And there's not really a great way to do that yet, although we put a lot of thought into that. The other thing I think that comes to mind is a lot of the tools, and you were saying that the digital ecosystem is kind of I think you said that's kind of the one that's coming through on the pole. Software and digital tools that are required to support this cell and gene space can't be built the way tools were built in the past, right? We're not building an ERP system or CRM system or what have you. You've got to be able to adapt quickly, and you don't want to have to constantly change infrastructure because a new therapy comes or whatever. So it has to be able to be done quick. It has to be able to get to the users in a timely fashion, and you can't go through these long cycles and wait a quarter to have one field added to a screen or what have you. So now is really the time to start talking about how do we do better in this orchestration model, and how do we weave these things together.
Great. So thank you, Anthony, for giving that overview. Anthony is the CEO at BlueSquared. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to ask the panelists to wave when I say your name. I mean, everyone's names are on screen, so But Andy Case, so former Senior Director of Supply Chain Technology at Novartis. Andy was involved in the launch and operationalization, there we go, of one of the world's first commercial CAR T therapies. We've got Art Mallion, who's the former Executive Director of IT, Head of Cell Therapy Digital Platform at BMS, and he helped scale operational frameworks during the industry's first wave of commercialization. And then we've got Ronit Slotky, who is the Director of Cell Therapies Manufacturing Facility at the Hackensack University Medical Center. So an absolutely stellar panel that we have sort of lined up. So Andy, I'm going to come to you first, sort of talking about that digital ecosystem that obviously came up sort of, just ahead on the poll that we've just done. You lived through the first wave of CAR T commercial build at Novartis. I understand you were the business application owner for CellChain, which was the orchestration platform built to run Kymriah. So with the benefit of portfolio scale and hindsight, what did the first wave playbook assume about digital orchestration that doesn't hold when a sponsor is running multiple sort of autologous and allogeneic programs in parallel?
So thank you. And it's great to be here. So at the very beginning, there were basically two players. There was Novartis and Kite, and we were in a race to get commercially launched. And we were making this up as we went along, right? Nothing existed. It was a completely new way of doing business because the medical center and the patient themselves are the starting material. And so you had to figure out a way to link the patient to a complex supply chain, to a complex manufacturing process, and get that drug product that gets manufactured back to that patient at that medical center in a way that you can defend to health authorities that you've done this correctly, so that you don't kill the patient if you mess up chain of identity. And that is kind of the underlying risk that we face with autologous therapies. And so we both developed applications to control the chain of identity and the entire business process. I mean, there's a ton of complexity that is centered around chain of identity, but there's supply chain transparency, there's getting the order from the treatment center, there's getting the information about the apheresis collection so that we know what we're actually receiving to manufacture. There's letting the treatment center know what's going on in the process, because they don't want to be blind. They don't want to, just do the apheresis of the patient and then wait and hopefully the drug's coming back in a time frame that is acceptable to the treatment of the patient. They need to know the status, and they need to do things with the patient to prep for the infusion of the therapy. So none of that has changed, right? All of that's still true with autologous therapies. And then, as you alluded to, and as Anthony mentioned, the landscape has changed dramatically with just a broad range of related therapies that all fall under the category of cell and gene therapies. So the actual gene therapies that are genetically changing the patient, the allogeneic cell therapies, iPSC-based therapies, in vivo CAR Ts, mRNA therapies. So all of these are related in terms of the challenges that they have. They're not some of them aren't quite as complex as autologous cell therapies, but you still have patient specificity. There's dosing that's patient specific. You're still doing usually a cryopreserved or a minus 80 degree shipment directly to a treatment center. So you have to have a supply chain that does direct shipments globally to all the treatment centers that you're dealing with in the world. So all of these things bring in the same complexity that we had, now almost 10 years ago. So we're still addressing that. And I think the discussion with the people on the panel could get into kind of, okay, the same challenges remain. We still have to figure out a way to link a manufacturing process and a complex supply chain to a treatment center. Now well over probably 750 or 1,000 treatment centers around the world that are working with these therapies, treating patients with these therapies. And we need, and as I said, you have 15, I think probably, of the top 20 pharma companies in the world are in this space, along with literally hundreds of biotechs that are in the space and out of the space and back into the space, or getting acquired by the bigger players. So there's a proliferation of the types of therapies that can address these diseases. There's a big proliferation of the types of diseases being addressed. It's still oncology, of course, but autoimmune, genetic defective diseases are all falling in this space. And so we've actually, the problem's actually grown rather than gotten more complicated rather than less complicated, because of the number of therapies, the number of treatment centers involved, the number of types of treatments that are being done, and the number of companies playing in the space. We still need to address how we make this complex supply chain and manufacturing process work. And I think, having Ronit here is great, because she can represent the treatment center side of the equation. And I think we could have a good discussion around her challenges versus the manufacturing supply side challenges, and figure out ways to try to link these two challenging processes together.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for that, Andy. I mean, at Art, you're running sort of the commercial operations across 2 approved autologous therapies at BMS, plus a broader CGT pipeline. So where does the treatment journey actually break down when multiple programs are live at once? I mean, you've got the patient identification handoff, the slot booking layer, chain of custody, somewhere else entirely. And once you've obviously identified that, what are you doing about that sort of, that perhaps a phase 2 sponsor wouldn't see coming?
Yeah. Great question, Becky. I mean, I wouldn't say it breaks down necessarily, but rather the complexity increases dramatically, especially if the two therapies have different manufacturing processes and/or supply chains. And the challenge is really to mask that complexity of the different products, the different therapies, the different manufacturing sites, and perhaps even different markets where you may have your therapy approved for sale for treating patients. But the challenge really is to, as I said, mask that complexity for the healthcare provider, and to get a bit specific, where I've seen it resolved, or at least the complexity simplified a bit, is to build some of that logic into the systems that have actually enable that process, especially the patient enrollment portal, and minimize the choices really that an HCP needs to make, a healthcare provider needs to make, or even needs to know about, quite frankly. So once they select the therapy they want to prescribe for their particular patient, the portal will, behind the scenes, know if it's a clinical patient or commercial patient. They'll know how they could or should know how much manufacturing site capacity you may have for that particular therapy. The manufacturing lead time that could be communicated back to the provider. And then your back-end systems and any communication across those systems really should be controlled either via process or as you start to scale via automated integrations, especially at scale, because you really want to avoid your systems becoming that barrier to scale as hopefully the patient volume increases. And a phase 2 sponsor may not see coming that they may need to invest in those systems to automate and better control the processes. And those interdependencies between those highly connected processes maybe sooner than they may realize. And maybe before these processes, as I mentioned earlier, become a barrier to scale.
Great, thank you. And Ronnie, coming to you, last but definitely not least. So you sit on the receiving end of sort of every sponsor's coordination model, essentially. What does operational governance look like from the coordinator floor when you're running programs? So from 6 different sponsors simultaneously, and where's the gap between what sponsors think they've built and what actually reaches your desk?
So to go back, I think Andy and Art really described very well on what they see on their end. I think one of the main challenges that treatment centers that's what they are. They are treatment centers, and they are operating to take care of patients, not necessarily to manufacture a drug. And that's, those drugs in that way, they're very different from any other drug that we have ever handled before, because we are part of the manufacturing process, whether it's collecting the starting material and packing the starting material and receiving the drug. And also, if you think about usually in a hospital setting, the entity that receives the drugs, it's pharmacy. And now you depend on more departments that have to participate in that. So that's one of the challenges. The other challenge is that our environment is chaotic, right? I mean, we have patients with many issues. You can plan and things go wrong. So at the end of the day, the patient is our priority. And I call it, we are one against everybody else, because every manufacturer, even if their software and platforms are amazing, they deal with just one platform. And they build them similarly to different drugs. But on our end, we probably have to deal with 20 or more portals. Each one is different. And Art, you mentioned the clinical and commercial. Some of the company have a different platform for the investigational and the commercial. So even if the drug looks the same and sounds the same and you do exactly the same thing, you deal with different CRO companies, the whole process is different, you have a different login. So these have been really challenging, because the manufacturer asking the people on the treatment side to hold everything else and now log to their platform and put whatever information is there. And it's true that this platform, Andy mentioned the Kymriah. Yes, we dealt with the platform from the beginning. But at the beginning, and I remember it quite well, we just scanned document into this platform. We did not have to type anything there. Now they are using the treatment centers to collect more data. And so we are actually expected to click through all these steps and put a lot of data. Sometimes it's they ask to have two verifiers because the process required two verifier of patient identity. So now you need two people to drop everything, leave the patient in the bed, and go and do that. So that became a really, really big challenge for treatment centers. And it's really add a lot of complexity to the process.
Yeah. And actually, I'm going to hold that thought, because that actually leads quite nicely onto sort of, I guess, taking the temperature of sort of our lovely audience watching. So it's time for another poll. So there you go. So if you've been sort of just sat listening, it's poll time. So thinking about the last 12 months, where do we think the coordination failed most often? So we've got sponsor to treatment center handoff, chain of identity, or chain of custody, cross-portal data, and internal sign-off and governance. So you should all be able to see the poll there. It would be good to get sort of people's thoughts around that before we sort of move to the next stage, really. And Ronit, I'll come back to you just to sort of finish that thought once we've got the poll results in. So
Becky, while we're waiting for the poll, it makes me think of something, because this came out actually at the roundtable too. And Ronit, your point about the fact that they're trying to get you to collect more data, there's a fundamental in art. You talked about everybody's in a silo. So if you're at BMS or Novartis or Roche or wherever you are, these are big companies and you're in silos. Well, expand that out, right? So you got the sponsor, your CRO, the CDMO, the health center, the lab, whoever you've got in this supply chain, they're all in silos. And what's interesting and what we're finding is that people are only thinking about themselves in a sense, right? When you think about it, and I think at the roundtable, Bruce Thompson from Kinsell Bio said this, it's like the basic business tenet of the customer, and providing customer service and doing well by your customer is missing. So like at the end of the day, when you think about it, how do you make it easier for Ronit to actually get the patient? Because without the patients coming through, because you have some gene therapies that have been taken off the market, right? Because they didn't have enough patients, right? Or they didn't get the physicians to kind of engage enough. But I think people are forgetting that. How do you make it easier for them? How do you actually get that customer satisfaction rolling through? Because at the end of the day, we're all here to really try to improve a patient's life, right? And now it's kind of like Indiana Jones trying to get to the Holy Grail, right? He's got to go through all these different snakes and this and that. It's as you go through this, like how do you make it easier? And technology is really just one part of it. It's really not hard to build a piece of software or what have you to actually handle this. But I think there's also in how it's being dealt with along the different nodes along the way.
Yeah.
Before you answer that, Ronit, I was just going to say so we've got the results of the poll, and sort of thinking about the last 12 months, sponsor to treatment center handoff, sort of at least for this audience, seems to be the sort of top reason in terms of where that coordination sort of failed most. So
I just wanted to mention one more thing, and I'm not sure if we talked about it before, but another hurdle but it's more of the IT security level for most hospitals is that the companies are asking to have patient information, as that you all know we are not supposed to share. We have a lot of government rules all over the world about not sharing patient information, and what we found that sometimes it's very hard to negotiate with the manufacturer the level of security that the hospital is hoping to get from them. So, we have to guarantee that we'll be responsible for so many things, but when it comes to negotiate the IT and the security, very often we are getting stuck in a circle until we can get to the middle ground. And I think that's another thing that companies have to be aware of, because we had a lot of contract that got stuck for months just because of that.
Yeah.
And a hospital IT department will not budge. I mean, they will not let go until they get what they want. Because if not, we are in trouble. So that's another level, that now you have all this patient information, or at least minimal patient information, on so many platforms, that we need to have a guarantee that they are secured.
Yeah, absolutely. And sort of broader question, and Andy Art or Renita again, anyone can answer. Sort of thinking back, would you build the same orchestration infrastructure today? So the same vendor stack, the same portal topology, governance model that sort of were built within those sort of first wave programs? Or is the discipline that scales a genuinely different discipline from the one that launched sort of the first CAR-T models? What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, so if I can, I'll take a crack at this. So I do have a vision about this. And it goes back to what we've been discussing now, is that honestly, the manufacturers haven't done a good job of taking the side of the treatment center and doing, setting up the process to deliver these therapies to patients from the point of view of the treatment center, and what we would need to do to engage with them in a way that makes their life as easy as possible. That's what we should be doing. And for a lot of different reasons, some, super valid reasons, some just not good at all reasons, it's really difficult. And what I think we need to do, and what I would advocate, and it kind of goes to addressing Renet's patient data, HIPAA and GDPR concerns, is that we really should start the whole journey in the EMR system, because that's the meaning of life to the treatment center. Everything they do is in their electronic medical record system, Epic or whatever it is. And if you're ever a person in a hospital, you know that even to get an aspirin, it still comes out of the Epic before you can be given it. And so that's where the data is. That's where the patient sits. That's where the treating team schedules the patients and knows what's going on. So if we can find a way to securely link into that system via an interface, and have the treatment center engage with the therapy manufacturers via their system of record, I think you go a long ways towards addressing the concerns of the treatment centers around the world. Now, it's easy to frame that. It's not so easy to implement that. But in the world today, 10 years on almost from when these therapies first launched, most definitely facilitates these kinds of interactions, like supply chain and computer technology to link into systems securely in ways that will keep everybody's data safe are much more advanced now than they were 8 or 9 or 10 years ago. And I think if we start down that road of starting the whole process from the point of view of the treatment center, we can go a long ways towards making the treatment center process much simpler, which I highly believe will facilitate further access to patients, easier access to patients, faster treatments for the patients, broadening the reach that we can get to treat the patients. Like all of the things that would be very positive in advancing these therapies would be addressed this way.
Great.
Again, he's trying to get on Ronit's good side now.
Yeah, right. Well, I think it's I actually think that it's definitely a valid point. I also think that a lot of systems are kind of closed, they're like closed systems where they kind of want you to live in their ecosystem. But what we found is it's very important to be kind of integration first, keep people in the systems, which is basically what you're saying that they're used to being in. But it's also it's a two-way street, right? It's if you build a product for somebody, you usually go and you talk to the people who are going to use it to see how best to provide that product. But then those people who are going to use the product also have to be able to be willing to talk, right? So the sponsors have to be willing to come to the table, and the ACPs have to find enough time to actually come and sit and talk about how do we make this faster, right? What can we do in terms of leveraging the EMR, but maybe we can't do that 100%, whatever that split is. But it still feels like the parties are not always coming together to kind of talk like you would in a normal, how do I build my iPhone better? Well, you got people who play with it and they watch and they say, I don't like that, right? And then they fix it. So,
yeah.
I mean, for me, it's a bit of a multi-part answer, to be honest, Becky. If you think back then, seems like so long ago, but really isn't. But the environment was incredibly dynamic. The regulatory bodies were still trying to figure out how to regulate this industry, these products. Our personal go-to-market strategy was constantly changing because we were trying to figure out how best to market our products to the providers that would prescribe them. So our systems really needed to be ready for changes and being able to make those changes sort of at the speed of business. So this was our number one priority. So this drove us to modularize, drove us to build or buy best of breed solutions for each component of the process. And we had to actually build internal IT teams to control and enhance those systems as needed. There also, at the time, there wasn't a lot of industry experience available to us, so especially in the software space. So we were truly on the cutting edge and building capabilities to enable our processes that didn't exist. And this, as you can imagine, it is or was a pretty costly endeavor, but it was necessary. And thankfully, we had the backing at the time to make that happen. But we also learned some things that the factors we initially thought would be vastly different and therefore needed different systems or solutions to support, such as clinical, touched on a little bit, such as clinical versus commercial. They are much more alike than we originally thought. Global versus US or regional, much more alike than we originally thought. So it actually caused us to do a lot of rework. So again, more costly system work that maybe weren't needed to enable scale. So we actually eventually ended up with one portal for both the globe as well as clinical and commercial, and with the flexibility it built into the portal to support different languages. But being an optimist, I think some of that dynamic nature has become a little bit more stable. We've learned a lot more, so we don't have to necessarily worry about the unknown, so to speak. And tactfully, if I just get a little bit tactical right now, I would say I think there's more CGT purpose-built solutions available than there were then, at a much better price point now than there were then, so that have a much better chance of meeting your specific business needs now than there was then. So I would strongly consider looking at some of these vendor solutions, adopting some of these vendor solutions. Not only will you get a solution at a lower cost than if you had to build it yourself, but you may be able to take advantage of a lot of the knowledge these software vendors are starting to accumulate and build into their tool set, rather than you having to figure it all out, so to speak, on your own. Unless you're in a camp that AI is going to solve everything. But if you're not, you might want to consider some of these tools. But you actually touched on, Becky, the governance model too, and I think that's an important point to bring up, because I actually don't think that's much different. The governance model that works is a model that kind of reflects your organizational construct. So it's clearly defined. You have to really have clearly defined and communicate who those process owners are. So random people, but you mentioned under stress, making decisions that maybe they shouldn't be made based on somebody else's process, meaning a decision to invest in technology that might not be necessarily aligned to the long-term vision of that particular process. So the governance model needs to have the key people, the right people identified, the people that have the ownership of those processes identified. Decisions on your governance model must be very transparent. And the scope of that governance should include the processes and the changes that might be need to made to the IT system to enable those processes. So I would continue to establish that particular governance model. Perhaps you might want to consider an overall IT architect that understands how all the systems talk to each other or should talk to each other to enable that process. So you're not unknowingly maybe breaking one system by changing another. So anyway, I think the governance model still needs to be in place. I wouldn't change that much, but you need to make sure you have the right participants and the right owners.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Renée, sorry.
No, if I can, I mean, I think to be fair to the industry, a lot have changed in the last 15 years. And I think the challenge is recognized. And we have seen a lot of companies hiring people with clinical background, trying to improve their the whole process of drug delivery. I think at the beginning, everything was built on model of drug manufacturers. They always knew it, and then they realized that it's very, very different. I will add that I think it's even more important now to make the changes that we need to do because, as Andy said at the beginning, we are expanding beyond cancer centers and oncology. In which, again, originally everything was built around this department. You work with the people who are doing bone marrow transplant or pathology. Now everybody is involved. And even in the hospital side, I need to figure out how do we bring everybody on our end under the same umbrella because we're working with neurology, rheumatology, hemoglobinopathy. There's just so many people who have never done cell therapy before. And so it's just becoming more complex. And if we really want to eventually be able to offer low toxicity drugs, not just in what we call treatment of excellence, we need to make it as simple as possible because otherwise we will never be able to do it. So I think the urgency to simplify the drug life cycle or chain of custody, chain of identity, however you want to call it, is even more urgent today. And I agree that it's one of the things that needs to be done is for companies to actually spend some time understanding how different hospital works because each one of us works differently. So if you design a drug like Humira with UPenn, that doesn't mean that other hospitals work the same. And I think it's really, really important to pay attention to these little details and that whoever develops the software, the platform, really understand what it means, what these clicks mean on the other side, and does it really make sense?
Yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. Thank you so much.
Yeah, maybe I'm going to just add a quick point about complexity. The science and the make to order process, it really is complex, as I'm sure you all know. So don't even make it more complex by trying to fit it into an old make to stock organizational construct, if you will. So internal to the manufacturer. Think about that there with the traditional silos and the handoffs and maybe even misaligned incentives and metrics. So my point is just be careful if you have the within your remit to organize, be careful how you organize as you scale and consider how complex and interconnected all these different processes are, even internally to the manufacturer.
That's actually super. It's easier for smaller, I think, organizations to do that because they don't have it. But what I found is on the larger ones, you basically have a startup inside of a very large company, and it's very hard to sometimes break we always do it that way. Well, it doesn't quite work for this. We're not going to do these kinds of release cycles. We're not going to do, the governance. We set up a governance program where, speaking of governance, which is super important, actually, we had identified the key people. I think there were 3 or 4, met every Friday. And if we didn't need the meeting, we canceled it. And you could always have like an emergency one if you needed it. But the idea was to keep everything, because things are so fluid. So whether it's the technology being able to adapt quickly, or the governance being able to adapt quickly, the whole thing has to be set up and managed and thought through so that you can adapt. As you say, the therapies change, or you acquire one, or you get results from your trial and you want to tweak something, and it shouldn't be an onerous task like it can be in a large organization.
Yeah. Thanks so much, everyone. That was fantastic. I'm going to push us on a little bit, only because we've got 20 minutes remaining, but I think we could talk about that forever. So for sort of our lovely audience, we're going to sort of have some multitasking. I'm going to launch 3 polls at the same time so that we can just, again, sort of get a gauge from who's in the room and obviously focus at the moment. So hopefully you will see 3 polls just about to come up on your screen, but whilst our lovely attendees are answering the polls, our lovely panelists, I'm actually going to give you a question that we've been asked from Cameron. So for attendees, first of all, so the first poll you should see on your screen is, how does your organization manage digital systems across the therapy journey? So you should now be able to see that. How does your organization verify chain of identity and monitor chain of custody across the therapy journey? And then finally, if a regulatory auditor arrived unannounced today, stressful, and requested a complete audit trail for a specific patient's therapy journey, how quickly could your team produce it? And the options are, slightly more detailed than just, really quickly. So whilst everyone answers those polls and questions for our panelists, so we actually have 2 questions from Cameron, so thank you very much. The first is, do you think predicting CRS before administration will broaden adoption of CAR-Ts and help the treatment centres reach more patients? And also, how do we make CAR-Ts a frontline treatment instead of a last resort? But I'd actually say that, obviously, Ronit, to your point, obviously the horizons are broadening so much, and it's not just CAR-T, not just oncology. So I'm actually going to sort of tweak that slightly, Cameron. So, how do we make these treatments, frontline instead of a last resort, sort of across the spectrum? So I don't know who wants to jump into either or those, but if someone would like to take a stab, that would be fantastic.
I can say that, first of all, we are seeing this trend happening. It cannot happen overnight because, like any other risky treatment, the regulator doesn't necessarily allow you to treat with that as a first line unless you show that it's a safe drug. So we started with drugs that were not the first line of treatment, but a lot of them proceeded with studies that offer them as a first line and show that they're as safe as a second or third line of treatment. And now we do have some of the drugs that are offered to the patient much earlier than they were before. I do think that if the toxicity can be reduced, and maybe Andy can speak to that a little bit. The CAR-T design, the design of their receptors, have changed, of the structure have changed to reduce toxicity and to offer a way to hold the toxicity. So I do agree that if they will be less toxic, we will be able to offer it to more patients because we can think, and I think some centers are doing it even today. If you can offer it in the outpatient setting and not in the inpatient setting, and you don't need a patient to be admitted to your hospital for a week or more, then yes, that opens doors for many centers that can offer that. And we do hope to see that. We definitely see it with the non-oncology CAR-T drugs. They are less toxic.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with Ronit on that one. There's a few dimensions to this. For sure, there's a ton of work being done to address the balance between dose and effectiveness of the therapy, but toxicity, because if the dose is too high, that's generally what drives the toxicity. And then on the dimension of, reaching more patients, if you only go to academic medical centers around the world, then that definitely limits how many patients you're going to reach. And because people around the world don't have access all the time to the large medical centers. So in order to make the therapies more easier to administer to patients. Obviously, you have to address safety. You have to address the complexity of getting the therapy to the patient, to whatever treatment center you're going to, and expand the footprint of the treatment centers that you deal with so that you can reach more patients. And then the original context in the question was, can we move these to frontline therapy? And I think all of the companies working in this space are attempting to do that through, clinical trials addressing it, through, different therapies that they're developing that are treating unmet needs, like in pancreatic cancer, for example, that could become frontline therapies. There's many that I believe now have become second line therapies through doing clinical trials to show that this is the best approach for these patients, and the health authorities have supported this. So I think there's a lot of work going on that is addressing safety. If you address safety, you can address the reach to things like what Ronit just said in terms of outpatient treatment of these therapies. If you can do that, then you can reach deeper into the treatment center landscape around the world, and by doing that, reach more patients with these therapies. And that, I think, is one of the biggest challenges for the industry, is how many patients we're actually reaching.
Fantastic. Thank you. Anyone else to add anything before we go back to the poll results? Great. So thank you everyone for sort of answering. So looking at the sort of first poll, how does your organization verify chain of identity? The winner was sort of a tie between manual label checks and barcoded labels, but very, very close. So I'll share those results. And if regulatory auditor arrived unannounced today, it looks as though most of you would be able to do that within minutes and hours. So that's fantastic. And then finally, how does your organization manage digital systems across the therapy journey? Sort of a split between spreadsheets, emails, and standalone tools, and dedicated software for specific functions. So pretty even split there. So interesting results. I'll come to Anthony for his thoughts, but just to provide some context on that, you will be receiving in the next couple of days an email for a free sort of assessment or complimentary assessment around sort of all of these systems. So if it's something that you're interested in, definitely take advantage of that. I would recommend you take advantage of it regardless. Check your junk mail, because obviously we all know where interesting things can sometimes end up. So Anthony, did you want to just sort of give a quick overview?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Becky. So yeah, we have an assessment actually that was still coming out of like I said, the meetings earlier, and we really started to think about orchestration maturity and how you kind of measure and deal with that. So we do have a maturity model. There's a white paper on it, and there's also this assessment that you can take. But in looking at the stuff that just came through on the polls, if COI is manual with some barcode, so that's kind of, it tells us that your digital ecosystem, well, you're on the earlier side. In other words, you can go from between being reactive, which is kind of the lowest side where you are doing manual, you're using spreadsheets and email, all the way up to something autonomous where your systems can actually be predictive. So there's kind of 4 levels to this. But what this tells us is that if you got manual and barcode for the COI and you're running things on spreadsheet and emails, it's doubtful that you can pull together in minutes or hours all of that data for a regulator, because you got to go find all of that to track and trace it, right, across that entire supply chain. So it's interesting because the industry is running at about a structured level, which means they are using systems, they're disconnected, but they are able to kind of put those pieces together when a regulator comes in, and their governance is, I don't want to say ad hoc, but it's a little bit more structured. They have the right people in place, but it's not as, let's say, quick to adapt when things change. So it's interesting. It seems it's interesting poll results, actually. It'd be interesting to see what actually comes when you actually do the assessment, because the assessment will also give you the gaps, tell you kind of some low-hanging fruit that you can kind of execute on to be able to kind of move from one level to another, because you really want to try to move up the levels to become more efficient and be able to adapt as things change.
Thank you. And yeah, keep an eye out for that, because it's we like an interesting poll result. So we've got 10 minutes left, and so now's the time to ask questions. Cameron, I can see that you do have a question there, but I'm actually going to go first to some questions that we actually got sent through by someone that couldn't attend the webinar but wants to ask the questions. So Andy, these I think may potentially be best place for you, at least initially, to sort of kick us off with. But CAR-Ts remain among the most expensive treatments in healthcare. No surprise there. From your perspective, what are the primary drivers of that cost, and what opportunities exist to reduce CMC clinical development and sort of overall treatment costs? And then sort of adjacent to that, but as a separate question, to what extent are supply chain and logistics challenges responsible for those high costs and complexity in CAR-T therapies compared with, for instance, other manufacturing and technology-related challenges?
Sure. So yes, the supply chain is complex and does add a lot of cost, but I would say that the single biggest driver for the cost of the CAR-T therapies, especially autologous CAR-T therapies, because as was mentioned earlier, it's one manufacturing batch for one patient. The biggest driver is the manufacturing cost by far. And I think one thing that a lot of people don't understand is, or know, is that the material costs that make up the manufacturing costs represent well over 50% of the overall cost, sometimes 60 to 75%. So if you're trying to address manufacturing efficiency and cost of goods sold and cost of manufacturing, you have to take a really deep dive into material costs, number one. The second biggest driver is labor, for sure, and the manufacturing process for CAR-Ts is it's extremely complex. It takes a boatload of people. For example, the Novartis Morris Plains facility at the launch had over 500 employees to manufacture for essentially 2,000 to 2,500 batches per year. So if you do the math on that, you can see how costly it is. There are a couple of companies out there trying to develop automated manufacturing processes, fully robotized manufacturing. I recently visited a company called Multiply Labs in San Francisco that's working on this and has some really, really cool technology that they're working on. Solaris is another company that's been working on this for a few years to develop a fully automated manufacturing process that would address both the material cost issue in some context, because they're able to utilize materials in a much more efficient way, and very heavily address the labor cost challenge because they can automate almost the entire process end to end. So those are two companies that I would look at, and I'm sure there's several others trying to address this very complex challenge. That would be potential solutions for reducing the cost. And then in the broader scope, there's boatloads of companies working on allogeneic cell therapies where you can do one manufacturing batch for many patients. So let's say if you can do a single batch from a healthy donor-derived T cell collection and manufacture 50 batches from that one dose, you've essentially cut your costs by 1/50, because the manufacturing cost for a batch to address 50 patients is nearly the same as the manufacturing cost to manufacture for a single patient in an autologous context. And then there's many other technologies working on different ways to address these therapies in the first place, iPSCs and so forth. There's an endless list or in vivo CAR-Ts may actually jump ahead of allogeneic therapies. And in vivo CAR-Ts, the human body is the bioreactor. So you're not essentially manufacturing, you're infusing the payload into the patient and the CAR T is manufactured inside the patient. So those are all kind of out there in the future. They're starting to come into clinics now, and I think that's the direction that the industry is going in order to address this issue of cost, and the cost obviously is probably the key driver to patient access and patients having access to these therapies.
Thank you.
I would even add very strategic, very future thinking, Andy's comments, but I guess mine are more tactical and more short-term focused. And it really is related to the complexity and the manual nature, as Andy said. So even look internally at your own processes. Are there opportunities to simplify your own processes and your own internal organizations? And are there opportunities to leverage technology to automate some of those manual processes, even if it's handing data from one person to another or doing a COI check from one system to another? Are there opportunities to leverage technology to help automate a lot of that? Because even though for maybe the limited volume of patients you're able to treat now, once you try to scale and you don't think those manual processes are a big deal, as you try to scale up and treat more and more patients, those manual processes will become a big deal. So it would behoove you to invest sooner rather than later, even on your own internal processes and internal technical capabilities to enable those processes.
I think one of the problems there also, Art, is that when people think about this, which is interesting because it did come back with spreadsheets, well, the bigger guys spending whatever it was back in the day, 30 million or whatever to get these things built. But even, $6,000 a patient to do it, we really need to focus, which is part of what we try to do, is to bring the cost per patient down, whether it's the indirect costs like you're talking about in terms of the technology. And it really doesn't have to be that expensive, because I think if you're still using manual or you're on email and spreadsheets, if you miss a manufacturing slot because of something happened just in the communications of all that, that's a big cost, because now you may have burnt $100,000 on a manufacturing slot that you don't get back.
Excellent point, Andy.
Totally true.
Yeah.
Well, sorry, Renee, go.
If I can touch, the meaning of that cost to the treatment center, the cost of the drugs really dwarfs the rest of the treatment costs. And these drugs are beyond the cost of the drug, are expensive because of their toxicity and their complexity. You need specialized people who know what they're doing. You need to, you need to have a pharmacy. You have to have an emergency room. You have to sometimes have the patient for 10 days in the hospital. And that just adds a lot of money that the hospital needs to take in account to. And so it's a great financial risk for hospitals. And I think to go back to the low toxicity and drugs, I think that would make a big difference that would really reduce the cost of the treatment itself beyond the drug. And it would be really great to see if that would happen.
Great. Well, we've got 2 minutes left, so I'm going to ask a sort of future-gazing question, and then sort of 30 seconds each would be great. So in 5 years' time, which CGT programs are still running? Is it the ones that solve manufacturing, the ones that solve coordination at scale? And if it's the latter, what does the industry have to build between now and then if it doesn't exist today? So, Art, let's start with you.
Great. Thanks, Becky. Happy to start. Well, actually, I would say, at least from an IT perspective, we touched on it a bit. It's the complexity we as manufacturers are forcing down on the treatment centers. So I would love it to see, even from a manufacturing perspective, a world where we start to coalesce around a standard way of interacting with the treatment centers, whether it's to direct connect to the EMR, although I'm not optimistic that's going to happen within 5 years. But it could be, we could optimistically start to coalesce around a single portal or a set of principles by which we design our portals or build our portals. So the treatment centers are not constantly trying to figure out, okay, what was my password again? And how do I actually access it? How do I enroll a patient for that particular manufacturer's treatment? It's a lot of churn, if you will, or spin we manufacturers put on the treatment centers that I would like to think optimistically we could solve. But admittedly, I think the treatment centers are the ones that will need to be very vocal and provide that feedback back to we, the manufacturer, so we can internalize that a little bit more, pervasively throughout the organization, which would then force us to get more investments in those portals so we can make it easier for the treatment centers.
Thank you. Praneet, go for it.
I don't have much to add. I mean, that would be wonderful.
Right?
One portal for all. That would be a dream. And I agree, the EMR might be a bigger challenge than we were hoping to have, but we'll see.
Andy?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think the treatment centers have been loud and clear about it, the complexity that we, the manufacturers, are pushing onto them. So we definitely have to address that. I will challenge back, though. I think there are ways to link into the EMR systems that we could do. But fundamentally, we have to make life simpler for the treatment centers and make it easier for patients to get access to the therapies. Definitely, yes.
Thank you. And Anthony, last but not least.
Okay. I think there's two things. I think the first one is similar to what you're saying, but it's, treat your partners like customers as you go down the line and actually think about what's going to make them successful so you can be successful. And the second one is it's adaptability, whether it's your governance or your tools or the way that you're monitoring. You got to set these things up so that they can be adaptable and really look to how you can drive the cost of those down. And there are fairly simple ways to do that. So that's my 2 cents.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you to our fantastic panelists. Thank you to BlueSquared for obviously hosting. And again, last but not least, thank you to all of you that were able to join us today. In answer to one of the questions that I sort of answered maybe a little bit stealthily, is that yes, this will be available on demand, whether you want to rewatch it or whether also you won't be able to attend for the entire webinar today. So keep an eye out for that. Keep an eye out for the amazing assessment that will be dropping into your inbox as well. But wherever you are in the world, have a fantastic day, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.